Once again, welcome into the Cheap Seats, everybody. On today's episode, we're talking best teams in North American sports, at least over the last decade anyway. These are the teams that, on the field, gave their fans the most to cheer about, and gave opposing fans the most reasons to hate them. So, without further ado, here we go. Before we get to the list though, it is important for me to real quick go over how I decided to measure the success of each team. Because while I could have just given you the teams that won the most championships, I figured that was a little bit boring and you could just Google that if that's really what you wanted to know. So I took a few more things into consideration. Now if you've seen my worst 10 teams over the decade, some of this will be a bit repetitive at the beginning, but we'll just get through it real quick. Now, I didn't take into account any kind of individual player awards or anything like that because these are team sports and the point of this was success of the teams as a whole over the course of the decade. But as far as what I did take into consideration, I looked at teams' year-to-year win percentage and whether or not they made the playoffs. And if they did make the playoffs, how likely it was that they were going to get there at the start of the season, assuming each team in a league started on even footing. I also gave teams points for winning their division, earning buys in the playoff, winning playoff rounds, making the finals, and of course they got the most points for winning titles. Because even though I didn't want this to just be a list of who won the most titles, that is still the most important thing for each team going into the year, and is the biggest measure of a franchise's success over a long period of time. And after all that, I had to do some quick evening out so that with different playoff and regular season structures, things got evened out so that one league didn't dominate the top 10 while others didn't even appear in it. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get to some honorable mentions. Our first honorable mention is the St. Louis Cardinals, whose 919 regular season wins over the decade were second only to the Yankees in the MLB. But unlike the Yankees, they went to 2 World Series and won one of them. Second, the Cleveland Cavaliers, whose emotional roller coaster over the course of the decade was mirrored perfectly by the team's success. But once LeBron did return, the team went to 4 straight finals and won one of them, which really helped them bounce back from 3 years of less than 25 wins without him. And the final, but most successful of the honorable mentions, is the Washington Capitals, who won 7 division titles, were second in the NHL in wins, and first in the NHL in points, plus went to the playoffs 9 of the 10 years, but only have 1 Stanley Cup to show for all of it. For the Packers, the decade could hardly have gotten off to a better start, as they earned a wildcard spot with a 10-6 record, and took that all the way to Super Bowl 45, which they also ended up winning against the Steelers, back when you could make the Super Bowl as a wildcard team. And then the very next year, the Packers went 15-1, losing only to a woeful Kansas City Chiefs team late in the season, and earning a number 1 seed in the NFC. Unfortunately for the Packers, their second loss of the season would come in their first playoff game, as they would become the second sacrifice to the Eli Manning-led Patriot-beating Giants version 2.0, and as a result became the first and still only team to win at least 15 games in the regular season and not win a playoff game. And although the Packers never did go back to the Super Bowl, outside of that it was a very successful middle of the decade for them, going to the playoffs 5 more times in a row, winning 4 division titles in that time, and winning 5 playoff games in those 5 runs. Even making it back to the NFC Championship twice, although they would lose both of those to the 49ers and the Seahawks. And then, after stumbling and bumbling for 2 seasons and firing head coach Mike McCarthy, it appeared the Packers were going to sputter their way to the end of the decade, but managed to reel off 13 wins in the 2019 season, and made it to the NFC Championship before losing it again for a 3rd time in the decade. All in all though, at the end of the decade, even with questions circling about whether or not the Packers have been wasting Aaron Rodgers and his talent, they still managed to win the second most games in the NFL over the last 10 years. So while sure there might have been some room for improvement, especially losing 3 NFC Championship games, this was still a very successful decade for the franchise and gave cheeseheads plenty to be happy about. For the Seahawks, going into 2010, a new decade meant a new era, as they hired a new general manager and head coach in John Schneider and Pete Carroll. And while their first 2 seasons of 7-9 records are certainly not the most successful ones you could hope for, they were still a marked improvement over the previous 2 seasons, which were among the worst in franchise history. Plus, on top of that, in the first 7-9 season, they somehow managed to win one of the worst divisions football has ever seen, and went to the playoffs, where they beat the defending champion New Orleans Saints in the first round, on what is still one of the best runs in the history of the NFL. Even with a playoff appearance and even a playoff win, 2 7-9 seasons just isn't quite good enough. But fortunately for the Seahawks, they would have one of, if not the best draft in franchise history in 2012, where they took, among other players, Bobby Wagner and, in the 3rd round, Russell Wilson. With a new look, a new quarterback, and a talented young defense that was just coming into its prime, the 2012 Seahawks won 11 games and made it to the divisional round of the playoffs before losing to the Falcons on a last-second field goal, even after having a pretty incredible comeback from a terrible first half. And the next year, as Russell got better, so did the defense, as the 2013 Legion of Boom is one of the best defenses of all time. With a talented young quarterback still on his rookie deal and a historically good defense, the 2013 Seahawks won 13 games, the NFC West, and were the number 1 seed in the playoffs, which they rode all the way to the Super Bowl, where they faced Peyton Manning and what is also certainly one of the best offenses in the history of the league. The promise of an all-time great offense versus an all-time great defense seemed really exciting, but in the end, the game really wasn't. Unless you're a Seahawks fan, in which case it was pretty fun. The next year, with the franchise's first Lombardi in hand, the Seahawks won 12 games, the NFC West, and were once again the number 1 seed, which, once again, they took all the way to the Super Bowl after another eventful NFC championship. Unlike the previous year, the Patriots hung with the Seahawks and even took a late lead, but the Seahawks were 1 yard away from a second straight Super Bowl title when all of a sudden, in the following 5 years, the Seahawks had 4 more playoff appearances, 1 more division title, and managed to have a winning season in each of those years. While some may view the Legion of Boom era of Seahawks football as the dynasty that never was, it still was the most successful era of Seahawks football in the franchise's history, where they were 3rd in the NFL in wins, just 2 behind the Packers, found a truly elite franchise quarterback, and most importantly, won the franchise's first Lombardi Trophy. It's hard to have a decade where you win 2 titles, but from a success standpoint at least, don't improve from the previous decade. That is, though, just what the Red Sox managed to do, as they once again went to and won 2 World Series, this time against the Dodgers and Cardinals. Outside of the 2 World Series, the Red Sox won their division 4 times in the decade, as compared to just 1 division title in the 2000s. But this time, those were the only times the Red Sox went to the playoffs, as compared to 6 playoff appearances in the previous decade. And in the regular season, while they did still finish safely over 500, they had 48 fewer wins in the 2010s, which is largely due to the fact that they had 3 losing seasons in the decade, something they didn't even do once in the first decade of the century. Within just the 2010s, though, it was still a tale of 2 halves, as even though the Red Sox won a World Series in the first 5 years and also won in the second 5 years, the one in the first 5 years came sandwiched between 2 losing seasons, and the season they won the World Series was the only one that they made the playoffs. In the last 5 years of the decade, though, the Red Sox won 3 consecutive AL East titles, and in the 3rd year had a franchise best 108 wins, which they rode to that second World Series. Really though, from an outside perspective at least, the biggest difference between this decade and the 2000s for the Red Sox was that in the 2000s, the Red Sox were the long-time suffering, hard-on-their-luck franchise that hadn't had a title since well before the modern era. But in the 2010s, they've become at best a necessary evil for taking down their biggest rival, the Yankees, who they've become almost as insufferable as. Though granted, some of this Red Sox disdain may also come from the simultaneous success of the town's football team. Plus, it can't take away from the fact that for the second decade in a row, the Red Sox are one of the most successful teams in all of baseball. Remember how I said this wasn't going to just be about who's won the most titles? Well, here's your first example of that. Because while the Spurs only won 1 NBA title, what surrounded it was a whole lot more winning than what the Red Sox saw. Remember, the Red Sox only made the playoffs 4 times, and while it is much easier to make the playoffs in the NBA than it is in baseball, making the playoffs all 10 years of a decade is still very hard to do. But for the second decade in a row, the Spurs did just that, taking their streak of making the playoffs to 22 years. But this is just about this decade, a decade in which the Spurs never won fewer than 47 games, and accrued 44 more wins in the regular season than any other franchise in the league. And the Spurs weren't just sneaking into the playoffs, they won their division 6 times, and once in the playoffs, won 13 division rounds, going to 4 conference finals. But what's holding the Spurs down from being higher on this list is that they only went to 2 NBA finals and only won one of them. This coming off of a decade where they won 3 NBA titles, and another in '99. Even still though, it's clear the Spurs have been one of the NBA's best teams for a long time, and certainly over the last decade, and are very deserving of their spot on this list. The Penguins were the only team in the NHL over the course of the decade to earn 1,000 or more points, and if there was a President's Trophy for a decade as a whole, they would have that too, with 466 wins. Plus, they were also the only team to have 8 seasons with 100 or more points in the season. Like the Spurs too though, the Penguins' postseason success did not always match that of the regular season, as they got knocked out in the first round in 4 of those seasons, and only made it to the Eastern Conference Final 3 times in their 10 playoff runs. But fortunately for the Penguins, they did win 2 of those 3 series, and finished the job both years, winning back-to-back Stanley Cups in 2016 and 2017. Even with their biggest star battling through injuries over the last few years, the 13 years and counting of consecutive playoff appearances and 2 Stanley Cups will help the Sidney Crosby era of Penguins hockey go down as one of the best in franchise history. Also, the back-to-back Stanley Cup wins make the Penguins the 6th franchise to do that more than once, and the 3rd non-original 6 team. At the end of the decade, the San Francisco Giants were just barely over 500, and had only gone to the playoffs 4 of the 10 years, with just 2 division titles. So, in order for them to have earned their way onto this list, especially this high on the list, it took one of the strangest series of consecutive seasons professional sports has ever seen. Title runs, especially when there's more than one in a short period of time, usually signify the peak of years of buildup and a core of players that have stuck together for a number of years, which you can usually see by them having had a number of playoff appearances surrounding those championship victories. And just by looking at the 3 rosters of the Giants World Series winning teams, you might think that that's just how they did it, as catcher Buster Posey, 3 of the 5 starters in Matt Cain, Tim Lincecum, and Madison Bumgarner, including even a couple of the relievers, were on all 3 of those teams. So the Giants did have a consistent core of talent, but what you don't see is those other playoff appearances that usually surround these championship runs. I mean, just for example, the Giants were one of 4 teams that won 3 championships in the last decade, but while they only went to the playoffs 4 times, the other 3 went to the playoffs 7, 8, and 10 times each. And while this did all start in 2010 for the Giants, coming into the decade, they were on a 6-year playoff drought, so it's not like this even came at the tail end of years of success. But regardless of all that, in 2010, the Giants would go 92-70, win the NL West, and eventually the World Series, powered by Madison Bumgarner and Brian Wilson's beard. But in the following season, they would lose catcher Buster Posey to injury for a significant chunk of the year, and as a result, would win just 86 games and miss the playoffs. In 2012, though, Posey was back, and so were the Giants, winning 94 games, another NL West title, and after sweeping the Tigers, another World Series. Then, fresh off their 2nd World Series in 3 years, the 2013 Giants won just 76 games, not even getting close to 500. But that's okay, because 2014 brought a new season, and even more importantly for the Giants, an even-numbered year. And while the Dodgers did win the NL West by 6 games, the Giants snuck into the playoffs as the second wild card, which had been introduced just a couple years earlier. And though nobody gave the 5-seeded Giants much of a chance, Madison Bumgarner did playoff Madison Bumgarner things. The Giants used their weird, even-numbered year sorcery and found their way to a 3rd World Series title. In 5 years then, the Giants had been to the playoffs in every other season, and won all 3 of those World Series. So, in 2016, when the Giants found their way into another wild card, after having once again missed the playoffs in 2015 with another losing record. It seemed as though they were destined for a fourth. Even though it didn't make any sense, they still felt like favorites. But while the Giants would win the wildcard game, they would fall in the divisional round of the 2016 playoffs, and would fail to have another winning season in the rest of the decade, finishing the 2010s with 5 losing seasons and 3 World Series titles. Like the Giants, the decade got off to a strong start for the Heat, even if the last few years have been somewhat disappointing. And like the Cavaliers, there is pretty much just one reason that the Heat are even in this video, and that is LeBron James. Now, obviously, the run that the Heat went on in the early part of the decade also starred Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade, but Miami's big three revolved around LeBron. In July of 2010, just before the first full season of the decade, LeBron made his decision to take his talents to South Beach and join Dwayne Wade in what was already a playoff team. And in the 4 seasons that followed, the Heat would go on to win 72% of their regular season games, win the division 4 times, and go to the finals 4 years in a row, winning back-to-back titles in 2012 and 2013. And although the Heat had just won their first title in 2006, this marked easily the best era of Heat basketball, as in this 4-year stretch they won 3 more playoff series than in the rest of the franchise's existence combined to this point. In the 5 years that followed LeBron's return to Cleveland, the Heat did manage to win 2 more division titles, going to the playoffs those 2 more times, and although they did just win 1 playoff series, 2 division titles is still more than most teams managed in the entire decade. So it is at least a decent compliment to what they did in the first half of the decade, as they managed to finish with just 2 losing seasons in the 10 years. As the decade started, the Chicago Blackhawks were already on their way to a Central Division title with 112 points and a second seed in the West, which they would eventually ride to their first Stanley Cup title in nearly 50 years, beating the Flyers in 6 games. While the Blackhawks would continue to go to the playoffs for another 7 consecutive seasons, including 5 in which they scored 100 or more points, in the 2011 and 2012 playoffs they failed to make it out of the first round. But in 2013, things were a little bit different. After a lockout-shortened season, the Blackhawks came into the 2013 playoffs having won 80% of their games, which would have put them on pace for an NHL record 133 points had they played a full 82 at that same clip. And while their rate of winning did slow down in the playoffs, it wasn't enough to prevent them from winning another Stanley Cup Finals series in 6 games, this time against Boston. Over the next 2 years, Chicago remained one of the NHL's best teams, making it to the Western Conference Finals the following year, and then winning their 3rd Stanley Cup for the decade in 2015. However, although they would make it to the playoffs the next 2 years and even win the Central Division for a 3rd time, the Blackhawks did not manage to win another playoff series in the remainder of the decade, even missing the playoffs entirely the last 2 seasons. No matter how bad the last couple of years and current era of Blackhawks hockey is, the previous one had 3 Stanley Cups, their 4th, 5th, and 6th as a franchise, all while they got to watch maybe the best American player of all time in Patrick Kane. So it's not one that Chicago fans are likely to forget, or let anybody else forget for that matter. While the previous 3 teams on this list all ended their decades on quite a bit of a downturn from where things started, 3 years into the 2010s, the Warriors were well on their way to being one of the 10 worst teams in professional sports. But then, coming off of a terrible 23-win season, the 2013-2014 Warriors won 47 games, more than doubling their total from the previous season, which outside of the NFL is not something you see too often. But even more importantly, for just the 2nd time in 19 years, they would make the playoffs. And although they would fall to the Spurs in the 2nd round, the Warriors would not look back the rest of the decade. After another playoff season, even with a disappointing first-round exit, it was clear the Warriors were on the rise, and primed to start their 5-year dominance of the Western Conference and reign over the NBA in general. Over the last 5 years of the decade, the Warriors went to all 5 NBA Finals, winning 3 of them, the first of which in 2015 was the franchise's first NBA Finals appearance and victory in 40 years. And then, coming off of the franchise's fourth NBA title, they took their exciting perimeter passing, heavy on the threes play style, to a record 73 wins and 9-loss season, before facing LeBron James and the Cavaliers in the finals for a rematch. And 4 games into the finals, the Warriors had a 3-1 lead, and just as everyone expected, it looked like they were going to win their 5th NBA title and 2nd in a row. But then, to everyone's surprise, LeBron James and the Cavs went on to win the next 3 games, ending the Warriors' storybook season and winning Cleveland its first professional sports title in 30 years. Something that the Cleveland fans were all too smug about until just a few months later when the Indians blew a 3-1 series lead in the World Series to give the Cubs their first World Series title in over 100 years. In the offseason following their finals loss to the Cavaliers, the 73-win Warriors would get just what they needed to become competitive again and maybe make it to another finals by acquiring one of the most talented players in the game in Kevin Durant, a move that was wildly popular throughout the league, especially in Oklahoma City. With Durant joining the mostly homegrown super team of Curry, Thomas, and Green, the Warriors would go on to avenge their loss to the Cavaliers by winning their 5th and 6th titles against them, even if it did come at a cost of the exciting play style that everyone had come to appreciate from the Warriors. And even though Golden State would eventually lose to the Raptors in their 5th finals appearance in a row, this was still one of the most dominant eras of basketball from any team throughout NBA history, and certainly makes them the NBA team of the decade. I mean, who did you really expect to be number 1? Look, I'm not going to spend too much time on the Patriots because this video's already gone a little bit long, and let's face it, Boston fans really don't need their tires pumped any more than they already are. But with that said, there's really no ignoring the fact that for the 2nd decade in a row, the Patriots were one of the best teams in sports. Only this time, they weren't just one of the best teams, they were the best team. And it really wasn't even close. In the regular season, the Patriots only once failed to win 12 games, and in that season, they won 11 games, racking up 125 wins, which is 23 more than the 2nd place Packers. Seeing as how their division hasn't necessarily been one of the strongest in football over the last 10 years, it should come as no surprise that they not only went to the playoffs, but won their division in all 10 years of the decade. Even outside of the AFC East, though, in a front-loaded AFC conference, the Patriots managed to get a first-round bye in 9 of the 10 years, only failing to reach at least a 2 seed in the last year of the decade. And then, once in the playoffs, even with 9 byes, the Patriots won an NFL high 16 playoff games, going to 5 Super Bowls and eventually winning 3 of them, making that 6 Super Bowl titles for the Brady-Belichick era. Even in the final year of the 2010s, where Brady finally started to show his age and raised questions about whether or not he's played his last game as a Patriot, they still won 12 games and put together another dominating defense. So it's entirely possible, even with Brady gone, that we haven't seen the last of this team in the later rounds of the playoffs. Although I'd really hope we have. But even if this is the end of the Patriots dynasty, it has still been one of, if not the best one in the history of the NFL, and there's no taking away from the fact that over the last 20 years, this team has been the gold standard for success for not only the NFL, but really all of professional sports. Alright, well, that is finally the end of my list for the top 10 best, or at least most successful teams over the last decade. As always, if you like this video, there's a button down there for that. If you really liked it and want to see more, like, for example, the 10 worst teams of the decade, there's a button for that as well. If you felt like I left something out or left a team completely off this list, feel free to type all that up and let me know about it below. And I guess with nothing else to do, stay safe out there, and we'll see you later. Peace.